Hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, my friends, I know many of you have heard of the phenomenon of ghost guns. Now, just hearing the word ghost in front of anything makes you think of a spooky, fear-filled adventure of sorts in which you may be either fighting for your life, your sanity, or both. But I'm here to tell you that the actual subjects of that term, the guns, are not really as spooky as many folks make them seem. So, just to explain for you who are unacquainted with the term or what ghost guns mean, all ghost guns are firearms that can be manufactured without a serial number or any sort of official form of identification in someone's home, and then can be fully assembled and used for whatever purpose the person wants. Now, these weapons have been at the sort of at the center of public debate over safety and gun control. In fact, President Joe Biden said both in his gun control press conference, which he held a week ago, and in the joint address, which he held a few days ago, that ghost guns, by name, are dangerous and need to be banned. Now, this is despite the fact that ghost guns have not necessarily been used in a lot of the mass shootings that have happened. There have been some instances in which ghost guns have been recovered from some pretty unsavory people. For example, you had this incident here over in Pennsylvania where you had Nazi paraphernalia and ghost guns confiscated from a drug-addled couple's home. You have this incident over here in Oakland. Oh dear, I don't have a subscription, so that's not going to work. But in Oakland, ghost gun violence has kind of gone up a little bit. And you really see all of this stuff culminating into a unified effort against these weapons. But here's the problem, my friends. First of all, associative qualities do not tell us about the inherent value of something. So, if you can associate a ghost gun with unsavory people, that association is morally meaningless insofar as if I associate a bottle of water with a Nazi or a certain kind of bottle of water with a Nazi, that does not necessarily mean the bottle of water has anything to do with the Nazi. So it's best to understand objects and things in relation to their actual purpose, to their function. This is why I think the idea of human nature is so important. This is why I endorse the idea of natural law, because it understands who we are as human beings, not as society would have us be, not as utopian notions would have us be. It understands who we are in terms of what is actually hardwired into us and what our faculty of reason can show to us, what we can find out through critical thinking. The same understanding has to be applied when talking about ghost guns. That's number one. Number two, as Reason.com mentioned, and I think Reason.com is a very good website, by the way. I don't read them all the time, but they're pretty good. As they mentioned when Biden released his proposal to ban ghost guns, they kind of mentioned in a sort of consequentialist way, hey, this is not going to be very effective because guess what? Ghost guns are actually meant to thwart government power. Now, this is a truth, but it is, I think, somewhat an unconvincing argument because for the public safety person, for the communitarian who's worried about the deleterious effects that ghost guns could possibly have on people, just because they exist outside of the scope of power does not mean they should not be subject to power. Now, this is a descriptive thing that Reason's doing, but they make a good point here that I want to touch on. Ghost guns, or do-it-yourself firearms, were actually started under a movement jump-started by Cody Wilson. And Cody Wilson, who invented, as this part here says, the 3D printed Liberator single-shot pistol, described his invention of these do-it-yourself firearm movement, these do-it-yourself firearms, as a war on power itself. And he sees his efforts as part of a broader push for personal liberty that also includes Bitcoin and payment systems that enable people to work around centralized authority. So, what I want to focus on, my friends, is where this comes from. This comes from, this is why this video is titled The Philosophical Origins of Ghost Guns. This comes from actually a theorist, or I think that this is inspired by a theorist, called Samuel Edward Konkin III. So for those of you who are familiar with Samuel Edward Konkin III, he was a philosopher back in the 80s who invented an idea called agorism. Agorism is this idea that a just and moral society will be one that consists of voluntary relations and trade between individuals without government power involved in the equation. So for Samuel Edward Konkin, he does not want there to be a state or a government. He wants to actually not only get rid of the state or the government, but while the state and government is here, he wants to subvert their power through voluntary transactions. He wants to sort of use the moral principles of voluntary action against what he views to be the immoral principles of government monopoly on force. Now, I'll be very, very honest with you guys. I am what they call a small government libertarian, a minarchist. I do believe there are legitimate purposes for the government. I do believe the government is necessary for the maintenance of safety and justice in society. But I do think there's something to be said about voluntary action being used to subvert things. This sort of philosophical principle of taking power down from the public realm and using it in a micro way to do something. There is something to be said. So I want to actually read some of Samuel Edward Konkin's words in his magnum opus, the New Libertarian Manifesto, in which he laid out this vision for this agorist society. I want to read it, and I want to explain how his visions are being translated into the idea of ghost guns. So on page 42 of the New Libertarian Manifesto, the 25th anniversary edition, Konkin mentions the idea of counter-economics. And all counter-economics is using sort of methods of trade and exchange outside of the scope of a centralized authority. We call this the black market. Now, Konkin is actually very clear in the footnotes here when he talks about black market. He says, while some coercive acts, such as murder and theft, are often lumped into the label black market, the vast majority of this is organized crime. It is perfectly legitimate to a libertarian, though occasionally unsavory. The mafia, for example, is not black market, but a government over some of the black market that collects protection money, taxes, from its victims and enforces its control with executions and beatings, law enforcement, and even conducts wars when its monopoly is threatened. These acts will be considered a red market to differentiate them from the moral acts of the black market, which will be discussed below. In short, the black market, here's his definition, is anything non-violent that is prohibited by the state and carried on anyway. So he uses a few examples here. He uses the example of the Soviet Union. He says that the black market actually provided Russians, Armenians, Ukrainians, this is back in the 80s when the Cold War was happening, and others, with everything from food to television repair to official papers and favors from the ruling class. He also mentions, on the next page of this, he mentions the sort of the victimless crimes that are so oftentimes penalized in society. He mentions that people who do bootleg and pornography, they're also having a sort of counter economy as well. He mentions what truck drivers did back in the 80s when the government set 55 miles per hour as a speed limit. He says that the trucking industry has developed CB communications to evade state enforcement of regulations. For independents who can make 4 runs at 75 miles per hour rather than 55 miles per hour, counter-economic driving is a question of survival. So smuggling, black markets, basically doing anything outside of the centralized imprimatur of the government is what Konkin would call a black market, and what he would call more broadly and more philosophically a counter-economic activity. Bitcoin, ghost guns are all counter-economic activities in that they seek to subvert the centralized power of whatever institution that they're targeting. For Bitcoin, it's the fiat currency. For ghost guns, it is the government regulations of guns, and they seek to assert voluntary and free moral individual actions into those spaces. So the philosophical importance of this, my friends, is twofold. Number one, I think that it really asks us, these counter-economic activities, to reevaluate our perceptions of power. When you hear the word black market, what do you think? You think of an unsavory underground with people who are getting shot and killed and ganked. But actually, a black market is simply the unsanctioned activities. My friends, life is not a sanctioned activity. You don't need a sanction from someone to live, do you? If you don't need a sanction from someone to live, why in the world should you need a sanction in every single activity you do, regardless of its impact on someone else. But the idea of power has kind of molded our definitions of what we think is necessary. So that's the second thing. It's to want the first thing that this can help us do is investigate our relationship with power. The second thing is to see, okay, how much of our understanding of the world is molded by government sanction. And number three, how much government sanction is necessary. There are a host of other philosophical questions that can emerge from the idea of counter-economics, but at their very root, these things may seem dangerous. But why do they seem dangerous? Ghost guns seem dangerous because they're not sanctioned. There's not a serial number, as Biden said. But does that make something inherently dangerous? There are plenty of actions that are not sanctioned that we do every day that are not necessarily dangerous. There cannot be a policeman at every single corner of society at every single time. In fact, I think that a good part of our existence, especially when we're out in the wilderness or when we're with people, when we're away from the police, is simply common respect, the brotherhood of man, as the great political theorist Walter Langland put it. My friends, a lot of our existence in society is not because force compels us to exist. It's because we respect each other. Now, there are some folks who do not respect anyone, and which is why we need a government, because those folks will organize and try to destroy and cause carnage. But most of our existence in society is simply due to mutual respect, not due to police force with the threat of us being locked up if we don't get along. So what I ask you guys to do, I ask you guys to think about three questions. Number one, what is our relationship with power in American society? Two, how does power shape and mold our understanding of the world? And three, does the idea of a sanction for every single activity, even activities that do not necessarily involve violent things, make any sense if we're trying to preserve the idea of individual freedom? And maybe even number four, what exactly is the importance of individual freedom as it relates to power? Think on it. As always, my friends, I love you. And if you want to support me, I encourage you to do a few things. Patreon.com/officialcwatson, PayPal, officialcwatson@gmail.com, or you can donate any other place if you want to. I mainly do Patreon and PayPal. But until next time, my friends, I love you, and please stay pensive. Bye-bye.